Hello everyone! Today we want to show you about the phases and the events that shaped the 20th century. This was a period of time in which the world transitioned from the industrial to the modern days. We start in the year of 1900s with the Boxer Rebellion in China. It was a response from the Chinese people to Britain's imperialist expansion, supported by Empress Cixi. Finally, in 1911, China became a republic established by Sun Yat-sen. Let's jump to Russia. In 1903, the Bolshevik group was founded by Vladimir Lenin as an opposition party against the Tsar Nicholas II. Rule. He was the spouse of Alexander of Hesse and father of Alexei Romanov. Lenin later became the leader of the October Revolution in 1917. 2 years later took place the Bloody Sunday incident, which was a strike against the Tsar's regime but ended in a brutal massacre. Meanwhile, in Mexico, a revolution had started to overthrow dictator Porfirio Diaz, with Francisco Madero, Pancho Villa, and Emiliano Zapata, among others, as head of the movement. One of the post-conflict results was a new democratic constitution and was put into action in 1917 by President Venustiano Carranza. Right in the year of 1914, Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Serbia, event which triggers World War I. 4 years later, Russia ends its involvement in the war to face their own revolution. The United States enters the conflict when Germany sent a Zimmermann telegram to Mexico, proposing an alliance against the Americans. As a resolution to the war, the Treaty of Versailles was signed, which punished the Central Powers, especially Germany. In that same year, the League of Nations was formed by U.S. President Woodrow Wilson to prevent future wars.
In 1926, the Cristero War was taking place in Mexico. It was a revolt against Elias Calles' regime because of his anti-Catholic policies. In 1929, it happened the biggest stock market crash and an economic crisis, the Great Depression. President Roosevelt quickly enacted the New Deal to help people recover from it. Moving on to Asia in 1930, Gandhi organized the Salt March in India as a non-violent protest for unfair taxes. This same year, the civil war in China between nationalists and communists was unleashed. 1 year later, Japan launched an invasive attack to Manchuria in a failed attempt of conquest. In 1933, Edouard Daladier became Prime Minister of France. In 1934, Mao Zedong, leader of the Communist Party, started the Long March to gain support of people. Simultaneously in Mexico, Lázaro Cárdenas nationalized the oil industry. Meanwhile, in Europe, German troops entered and annexed Austria. 1939 was a key moment for Europe. Adolf Hitler invades Poland and World War II begins. Pearl Harbor was bombed by Japan shortly after that. The Holocaust was the genocide of Jews like Anne Frank during this war commanded by Hitler, who allied Italian leader Mussolini. In 1943, Indian National Congress launched Quit India movement. This was a pacific disobedience movement demanding an end to British rule of India.
World War II finally comes to an end with Allied victory when USA explodes the first atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan. Going back to Europe, in 1945, two conferences were very significant to the world's history: the Yatla and the Potsdam, in which major leaders Joseph Stalin, Winston Churchill, and Franklin Roosevelt defined Europe's map after war. Germany is split into 4 zones of occupation.
The Cold War is an era in which distrust arises between US and Soviet leaders, and both countries try to influence others to their side, Americans with capitalism and Soviets with communism. Disagreements become evident during the Berlin blockade, in which the Soviet-occupied part of Berlin closed down West Berlin's railways and communication with them. While this tension was going on, in 1947, India gained independence from the British Raj, but the conflict didn't stop there. Muslims were exiled to Pakistan because of religious differences with Hindus. Later in the Liberation War of 1971, Pakistan was also split into Bangladesh.
In an attempt to stop the spread of communism around the world, US put into action the Marshall Plan, in which President Truman promised aid to all communism threatened countries.
The Korean War in 1953 is an example of the rivalry between the two major powers. Korea was split into communist-supported North Korea and nationalist South Korea supported by the United States. Neither of them won the war, and Korea is still divided like that nowadays. In the year of 1961, the Berlin Wall was built to separate communist and capitalist Berlin. 1 year later, a confrontation happened between the United States and the Soviet Union concerning Soviet missiles installed in Cuba as a strategic threat to America.
Had a very controversial event in 1968 with the Tlatelolco massacre, in which military men sent by President Gustavo Díaz Ordaz shot students who protested for autonomy. Another Cold War conflict was the Vietnam War. Vietnam was also divided into North and South, but both sides wanted communism. US invaded Cambodia with General Douglas MacArthur leading to prevent it. It wasn't until 1976 that Vietnam reunified at last. In 1974, the United States and East Germany established diplomatic relations, but it wasn't until 1989 that the Berlin Wall was taken down. In Spain, 1975, Francisco Franco died, and Juan Carlos is the new head of the government. The Soviets had always been interested in the Middle East territories, and in an attempt of conquest, they invaded Afghanistan. President Truman answered by boycotting Moscow 1980s Olympics and supporting the Afghans during the Soviet-Afghan War. Ironically, this military support turned into the foundation of Al-Qaeda terrorist group by Osama bin Laden. It wasn't until 1991 that President Reagan and Gorbachev formally declared an end to the Cold War. The Soviet Union was collapsing, and Russia, among other countries, became independent almost at the same time that Mexico, USA, and Canada signed the North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement. In Africa, Nelson Mandela, inspired by Walter Sisulu and Oliver Tambo, ends with the apartheid and becomes president in 1994.
An unfortunate accident in 1997, Paris, France, ends with the life of British Princess Diana of Wales. Concerning Latin America, Hugo Chavez seizes control of all Venezuelan institutions in 1999, giving birth to the Chavismo period, which lasted further than a decade. Now, can you see what we meant? The modern world wouldn't be the way it is today if none of this had happened. Good or bad, this was the 20th century. Thanks for watching.